Hello, and welcome to the Chapter 1, Part 2 lecture on the themes in the study of life. In this lecture, we're going to discuss living things and how we study living things. You should use the information in this lecture in conjunction with the Chapter 1, Part 2 guided notes. And when you've completed the guided notes, you should use that information to complete the Chapter 1, Part 2 pre-class quiz that's posted on Blackboard. Let's get started. In this lecture, we're going to discuss three major topics concerning how we study living things in biology. First, we're going to talk about how matter is organized into different kinds of subsets or systems. Second, we're going to discuss how we define living things and differentiate those from non-living things, and the 8 characteristics that all living things share. Third, we're going to talk about how we keep track of all of these living things, how we put living things into different categories based on their similarities and differences. The bodies of all living things, from bacteria to fungi to plants to human beings, are made of the same basic molecules or the same basic components. All of our bodies contain carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen, for instance, just in different amounts and arrangements. This slide illustrates that concept nicely. Look at this pile of blocks. Notice that from this pile of blocks we can build 3 very different patterns. The patterns all contain the same basic blocks, just in different arrangements. The bodies of living things are built in a similar fashion. Now, when we study biology, which is the study of life, we can study living things at different levels of organization. For instance, maybe today we're just interested in the molecules that make them up. So maybe in these patterns, we're just studying these blue squares, the individual molecules. On the other hand, maybe we're interested in something a little more complex, the groups of molecules. Maybe those represent an organ. So we can study the organs within these individual organisms. Or maybe we're interested in studying the entire organism itself, the entire collection of these molecules and organs, and how they work together. So the first thing we're going to discuss in this lecture are the different levels of organization at which we can study living things. So we're going to start with the smallest level, which are the atoms, the smallest known particles, and we're going to work our way up to organisms. And then we're going to talk about a few levels that exist that are bigger than the level of organism. Now, this system of organization works really well for large, multicellular, complex organisms, such as ourselves, and such as things like trees and fungi. But not all living things have all of these levels. For instance, it might surprise you to find out that organisms like sponges are really just collections of cells, but they really don't go above that level. They don't really have real tissues or organ systems. They're really simple organisms. Other organisms, such as amoebas and bacteria, they just go to the level of cell as well, but we still consider them living things. So not all living organisms have all of these levels, but all of the really complex ones have these levels. So let's start at the bottom and work our way up. The smallest known particles of matter that act predictably are known as atoms. Each different type of matter has a different type of atom. So there are carbon atoms and hydrogen atoms and nitrogen atoms, and they all behave a little differently from one another. Atoms consist of subatomic particles known as protons, neutrons, and electrons, and we're going to talk about them in more detail in Chapter 2. Now, if we take 2 or more of those atoms and put them together, we get something a little more complex. We get something known as a molecule. Examples of molecules include water, H2O, carbon dioxide, CO2, and so on. In this molecule, you can see the individual atoms represented as these little colored balls, and you can see that they are connected to one another by little bonds. And again, we'll talk about what the bonds are more in Chapter 2. Next, if we put molecules together into larger groups, one of the things we can build are things called organelles. The word organelle literally means little organs, which I think is adorable. So these are like little organs that exist inside living cells, and these little packets of molecules each have a specific job. They do something for the cell. For instance, you've probably heard of the nucleus. The nucleus is a little packet that holds the DNA for the cell. You may also have heard of a mitochondrion. Mitochondrion is an organelle that produces energy for the cell. So they all help the cell function. Now, if we put enough organelles together into the right configuration, we can get the next level up, which is actually the first living unit we've talked about. Molecules and organelles are not alive, but cells are alive, and all living things are made of cells. So now we've got something that's alive. Here, for instance, we have a plant cell, and you'll notice that if you look inside, there are organelles inside, and there's a bunch of different kinds. Different types of cells have different types and arrangements of these organelles, and that's what makes them behave differently from one another. If we take two or more different kinds of cells and have them working together towards a common purpose, we get the next level of organization. At that point, we have something called a tissue. There are four major types of tissue found in the human system. There's connective tissue, which connects things together. Epithelial tissue that makes barriers in the body, such as the outside of your skin or the lining of the heart. There's muscle tissue, which makes up the muscles. And there's nervous tissue that makes up the brain and nerves and the spinal cord. Now, if we take two or more types of tissue and put those together and they are working towards a common purpose, we call that level of organization an organ. So I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of the really big organs in the human system, like lungs and liver, stomach and intestines. Each of those structures is made of more than one kind of tissue, and they're working together, and each organ has some kind of job in the body. However, consider this. Something as small as a hair follicle can have two or more kinds of tissue inside it working together. So, for instance, a sweat gland inside your skin will have more than one kind of tissue, and the job is to produce sweat at the right time. So even something as tiny as a sweat gland can technically be considered an organ. That means that your skin isn't really an organ. That means it's the next level, an organ system. So let's explore that. Let's keep going. If we take all of the organs that are working together in a body towards a particular purpose and we put them together, we get the next level up, an organ system. I'm sure you're familiar with the digestive system. Here it is. And look at all the different organs that make up that very complex system. The stomach, the intestines, liver, pancreas, colon, all of that stuff has to work together in order for the digestive system to take in nutrients and distribute them to the body. As I mentioned before, your skin isn't really an organ. We often call it the largest organ in the body. But really, by definition, it's an organ system. And it's an organ system that consists of thousands of tiny organs all working together. Now, if we take all of those organ systems in the body and we put them all together, we get one organism. And here Richard Simmons is our example of one organism. Now again, not all organisms have all of these levels. So when I say organism here, I'm talking about a large, complex, multicellular organism. So that gets us to the level of organism. But what if we have multiple organisms, or organisms of different species? How do we organize that? For that, we need these levels of organization: population, community, ecosystem, and biosphere. Let's discuss what each of these means. If we are examining all of the members of a single species in an area, we have a group called a population. So for instance, if we looked at all of the humans that are in a room, we would have a population of humans. Now, if we expand out a little bit, we can include other species. So here we have a population of kids and dogs and plants. If we're just looking at the living things in an area, but it's multiple species, We refer to that as a community. It's all the biotic factors. Next, we need to take the abiotic factors into account as well, the non-living factors. So in this example, we have people and dogs and bacteria and fish living in the ocean and plants in the background. And we have the abiotic factors like the soil and the air and the sunlight. All of those things constitute the ecosystem. So there are coastal ecosystems, a rainforest is a good example of an ecosystem, etc. It takes into account both living and non-living things. Now finally, if we put together all of the ecosystems in the world, we get one big unit, which is the Earth, which we also refer to as the biosphere. This is just another quick illustration of the levels of organization using plants as an example. So you can see that it starts out at the largest level, the biosphere, works down to ecosystems, communities, populations, and organisms, and then it goes inside the organism to look at organs, and yes, plants do have their own organs, including leaves and stems and roots, tissues, cells, organelles, and finally, molecules and atoms. Hopefully you've been following along and taking good thorough notes on the guided note pages. And if you've been following along, you will have reached the first Your Turn section on the guided notes. Your Turns are sets of questions that allow you to practice the concepts while you're working through these videos. I do suggest that you do the Your Turn questions because the questions on the pre-class quiz, which is required at the end of this video, are going to be very similar to these Your Turn questions. So take a couple of minutes and answer the Your Turn questions. Our next major topic of discussion in this lecture has to do with how we define life in biological circles. Let's say that you find an interesting thing out in nature, and you want to know whether it's living or not. Is it a living thing such as a fungus, or is it a non-living thing such as a rock? It turns out that there are 8 characteristics that a thing has to have in order for us to consider it alive. And we're going to explore that next. If it doesn't have all 8 characteristics, then we put it in the non-living things category. And yes, there are some interesting things out in nature that are kind of on the border between those two categories, such as viruses and prions. To illustrate this, I'd like you to watch a couple of videos of this thing. One video will show it from the side and one video will show it from the top. And I want you to decide whether or not you think this thing is alive. And more importantly, if you think it's alive, why? Try to describe why you think that thing is a living thing or not. What are you looking at? What's telling you whether it's alive or not? So if you decided that yes, this organism is alive, you are absolutely correct. This little critter is known as a Daphnia or a water flea. They're totally harmless, they don't bite you. They're microscopic and they live in fresh water, and they use these long mouth appendages things to catch little things in the water such as paramecia. Now what is it that tipped you off that this was a living thing? Well, it can kind of be hard to put into words, but it may have been that you were noticing the first characteristic that all living things share, which is that they are all complex and they are all organized. They're not random like some things that we find in nature. One of the really neat things about Daphnia is that their skin is kind of clear, so we can see inside them under the microscope. And if you look inside this Daphnia, you're going to notice some things that might be organs and some things that might be organ systems. They even have some sense organs, like a little eye up here. And that level of complexity and order is often characteristic of a living thing. The second characteristic of all living things is that they are all composed of cells. If you remember, cells are the smallest unit of life. They are these tiny living packets, and they're typically too small to be seen with the naked eye. Now, there are many different types of cells in different types of organisms, but all cells have these three characteristics in common. All cells have some genetic material, some DNA, sometimes inside a nucleus, sometimes not, but these are the instructions for telling the cell what kind of cell it's going to be and how it's going to function. All cells have organelles, these little organs, little packets that perform different jobs inside the cell. And all cells have a plasma membrane. This is the kind of skin on the outside of the cell that separates the internal environment from the external environment. Third, all living things have to be able to respond to stimuli, to respond to the environment in order to stay alive. This can be on the whole organism level. For instance, if you poke a millipede, its response will sometimes be to curl up into a little ball to protect itself. Or this can be internal on the biochemical level. For instance, if you rub a plant leaf, there are certain biochemical reactions that are going to happen inside that leaf as the plant tries to defend itself from you. So all living things have to be able to respond to the environment in order to stay alive, and being able to respond to the environment is one of the characteristics of living things. Fourth, all living things have to be able to maintain homeostasis in order to stay alive and in order to be considered a living thing. Homeostasis is all about balance. It's the ability to maintain a stable internal environment despite a constantly changing external environment. Let's take body temperature as an example. Our body temperature, because we are warm-blooded, tends to stay at about 98.6 Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius, no matter what the temperature outside is. If it starts to get really hot outside, though, our body temperatures might start to go up. How does our body respond? Well, it makes us sweat, and the sweat is designed to help cool us off to keep that body temperature at around 98.6. Now think about all of the things, all the factors that a body has to keep in order around these set points in order to keep you alive from one moment to the next. If you think about it too much, it gets a little scary. But there are temperature factors, there are chemical levels, there are neural events, electrical events within the body, the position of your body. All of that stuff has to be kept stable in order for you to stay alive. Whenever these things get out of whack, we refer to this as a homeostatic imbalance. And I think of it as being kind of like carrying a tray full of drinks that suddenly gets out of whack, gets out of balance. It tips one way, one thing gets out of balance, and then it tips the other way as you compensate, and back and forth, and before you know it, organs are crashing and drinks are all over the floor. That's a homeostatic imbalance. Diseases, injuries, and disorders are things that push our bodies out of balance. And so sometimes these things are referred to as homeostatic imbalances. Maintaining a homeostatic balance depends on something known as feedback. Feedback refers to how your body responds to a particular stimulus, and there are a couple of different kinds of feedback. Positive feedback in general tends to increase the stimulus, whereas negative feedback tends to decrease the stimulus. Let's use this mouse as an example. When this mouse encounters the cheese, it's going to eat some of the cheese, and that's going to tell its brain, ooh, I really like that cheese. We should keep eating more cheese. That's an example of a positive feedback system. The body responds by trying to increase the stimulus. Now, on the other hand, if the mouse encounters a cat, its brain is going to tell it, less cat, please. Let's get out of here. And so it's going to cause the muscles to make the legs pump and make the little mouse run for his life. We would refer to this as negative feedback because the mouse is trying to decrease the stimulus. The next set of your turn questions is going to present you with a couple of different scenarios, and I want you to think about and decide what kind of feedback is involved in each of the scenarios. For instance, if it's hot outside and you're sweating, does that represent positive feedback that's trying to increase the stimulus or negative feedback that's trying to decrease the stimulus? Also, when an infant nurses, is the reaction in the mother's body releasing more milk, is that increasing or decreasing the stimulus? Is it positive feedback or negative feedback? Characteristic of life number 5. All living things have to be able to acquire materials and process energy in order to remain alive. Materials are these things we call nutrients. Nutrients are the things that we use to physically build our bodies. They can include everything from atoms of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen to more complex molecules such as carbohydrates and proteins, and they even include vitamins and minerals. We need all of these things to build our bodies. Now, energy, on the other hand, is a little different. Energy is the sort of force that makes matter do things, that makes matter perform work. So in order to make our bodies work the way that we want them to, you have to have a certain amount of energy. Nutrients and energy behave differently inside food chains, such as the one shown. Nutrients tend to be recycled as it passes from one organism to the other. However, energy tends to flow through an ecosystem. Let's take a look at nutrients first. Nutrients are those things we need to build our bodies. So plants, such as this tree and such as the grasses shown here, take in nutrients from the soil and also from the air, and they build their bodies. Now when the herbivores, such as the zebra, eat the grass, that organism takes in some of the nutrients and uses those nutrients to build its body. And when the predators, such as this lion, eats the zebra, it does the same thing. When these organisms die, the nutrients aren't lost. When this lion dies, for instance, things like fungus and bacteria are going to break that body down and take the nutrients back out, and they use them to build their bodies. So the nutrients are constantly being recycled within this ecosystem. They typically don't leave unless an organism leaves the ecosystem. Now, energy, on the other hand, tends to flow through ecosystems. What do I mean by that? Well, energy is first released from fusion reactions that occur in the sun, and they strike photosynthesizers, such as the tree and such as the grass. These photosynthesizers take in some of this energy and incorporate that energy into their sugars, so they make their own food. They then can use that energy to power their reactions. When the zebra then eats the grass, it takes in some of the energy from the grass and uses it to power its reactions. And when the lion eats the zebra, the same thing happens again. Now, the energy doesn't stay inside these organisms very long. A lot of this energy is going to be lost back into the environment as heat. And yes, even trees release heat. So the energy flows in and the energy flows back out. And that means that unlike nutrients, ecosystems need a constant supply of energy in order for all of these organisms to continue to survive. Characteristic of life number 6. All living things, from bacteria up to humans, grow and develop. They all have different stages to their life cycles, and they all change physically and otherwise as they go through these different stages. Characteristic of life number 7. All species have to be able to reproduce themselves in order to continue existing on the planet. Single-celled organisms, such as these shown here, tend to reproduce by dividing, by sort of cloning themselves and splitting in two. Multicellular organisms have more complex ways of reproducing themselves by recombining their genes with other individuals, or sometimes they have some tricky ways of cloning themselves as well. Characteristic of life number 8. All living things evolve. And here again, by all living things, I mean all species evolve, not all individuals. Evolution is one of the most important biological concepts and is probably the most misunderstood concept as well. So let's talk about it. I want you to have a good basic understanding of what I mean when I talk about evolution. Very simply, evolution is genetic change within a population, so within a group of organisms, from one generation to the next. So the idea of evolution tells us that genetic change can build up in the DNA within a group of organisms as they have babies, as they reproduce and pass their genes on from one generation to the next. Sometimes this genetic change can lead to physical changes and behavioral changes. So sometimes many generations down the line, those populations are going to behave and look different than their ancestors did. There are two sources for genetic change within organisms: mutations and recombination. Mutations are random changes that can occur in DNA. So we often refer to them as being mistakes in the DNA. And this can alter how the DNA functions. We'll take a look at mutations later on in the semester. Recombination is a part of sexual reproduction. It allows organisms to make new combinations, new groupings of their DNA as they pass that DNA on to the next generation. For example, when your mom and your dad decided to have you, they each took one half of their DNA and they combined them, and that combination is you. You are a new combination of their DNA. That's recombination. The thing that drives evolution, that causes organisms' DNA to change in particular ways, is known as natural selection. And you can think of this as environmental pressure. When the environment changes, sometimes those changes make it more beneficial to have certain DNA, certain genes, than other genes. For instance, if the environment becomes very cold over a long period of time, it's more beneficial to have genes that allow you to survive that cold than genes that allow you to survive in very hot environments. So organisms in that situation with those cold genes are going to be more likely to survive and pass those genes on to more offspring than the ones that have the genes for surviving hot weather. So in that particular case, the natural selection might drive the population towards retaining those specific genes. That's natural selection. Evolution through natural selection implies that physical change, sometimes pretty radical physical change, can occur within populations of organisms over time. For instance, fossil evidence indicates that the earliest tetrapods, these early four-legged animals, likely evolved from certain populations of fish. Now, how did they make that leap? How did they figure that out? Well, if you look at the limbs of four-legged animals, you find certain kinds of bones. And if you look in the fins of certain types of fish, you find the same pattern of bones. And this implies a relatedness between the later amphibians and the earlier, we call them lobe-finned fish. The theory of evolution implies a relatedness among all living things on the genetic level. A lot of people aren't comfortable with that idea. You know, we don't like to think of ourselves as being related to bacteria and worms and lowly plants and things like that, right? We like to think of ourselves as being superior and smarter and having dominion over all living things. But if you look at the DNA of these organisms, it tells a different story. It might surprise you to learn that 70% of your DNA is identical to a typical mouse's. That 50% of your DNA is identical to the average banana, believe it or not. So the more closely related two organisms are, the more closely related their DNA will be to one another. But this implies that there is a relatedness among all living things, and that all living things likely came from the same original genetic source. At this point, I'd like to pause and let you think about the 8 characteristics of life. Remember that if something displays all 8 characteristics, we consider it alive in biology. And if it doesn't, we consider it non-living. Even if it's only missing one characteristic, we tend to put it in the non-living category, although there's debate about that sort of thing with things like viruses and prions. For this exercise, I want you to think about a really sophisticated photocopier. There's some pretty darn sophisticated photocopiers out there. In fact, I used to work with one that if you kicked it accidentally, it would go into a diagnostic mode and repair itself. It seemed an awful lot like a living thing to me. I want you to think about a photocopier, and I want you to list out the characteristics of life that you think it has and the ones that you think it lacks. You'll find this exercise on your guided notes, and from this you can decide for yourself if you think a photocopier is alive or a non-living thing. Our last topic for this portion of the chapter has to do with how we categorize life in biology. In other words, how we can look at all of the living things that exist on this planet and somehow decide how to put them into different little organized categories with names. For this, we mainly look at three major characteristics. We look at the type of cells an organism has, the number of cells that that organism has, and we also take a look at how they get their energy. Sometimes DNA factors into this as well, and we'll talk about that. All living things will have one of two possible types of cells. They're either going to have eukaryotic cells or prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells store their DNA inside a nucleus, inside this little packet like this one has. Prokaryotic cells also have DNA, but you'll notice there's no packet inside to store it. It's just kind of floating around inside the liquid. Eukaryotic cells tend to be much larger and much more complex than prokaryotic cells. We have eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells, on the other hand, tend to be very small, sometimes thousands of times smaller than a typical eukaryotic cell, and they don't have membrane-bound organelles inside. So again, you're going to see that everything's kind of just floating around inside this cell willy-nilly, whereas in the eukaryotic cell, things are organized into nice little packets. We can also look at the number of cells that an organism has when we're categorizing it. Some organisms are unicellular, or single-celled. Here, for example, are some single-celled algae. That entire organism consists of only one cell. Other organisms, on the other hand, are multicellular. Our bodies, for instance, are made of trillions of different cells. Here's an algae that's a little bit more complex. If you look at all of these little individual dots, each individual dot is a single cell. So you can see that collectively, this is a very simple multicellular organism. We can also use how organisms acquire their energy to help us categorize them. There are essentially two basic ways of getting energy. Some organisms are self-feeders or autotrophs, also known as producers. Things like plants fall into this category. These organisms are able to capture the sun's energy and funnel it into sugars. So they build their own food, they make their own food. Organisms that are not autotrophic are often heterotrophic. Heterotrophs are also known as consumers. We are definitely in this category, and so is this cute little prairie dog here. Heterotrophs have to consume other living things to get their energy. So you can see this little prairie dog doing that, taking in these little flowers, and it's taking the energy and also the nutrients from these flowers. We can use this information to help group or organize living things into different kinds of categories. Now, if we look at all living things on the planet, we can split those organisms into three domains. Domains are the major groupings of living things. The domain system is sort of a new system. When I was in college, we didn't have domains. We had just kingdoms. But new genetic evidence has surfaced that implies that these guys should be split into different groups. So now we have the three domains of life. Here are the three domains. Bacteria, also known as eubacteria. Archaea, this is the new group that upset the apple cart, so to speak, and caused us to have this third group. And the last group is Eukarya. Eukarya is the group into which we are categorized. First, we have the domain bacteria, also known as eubacteria. Bacteria are all unicellular. They're all single-celled organisms, although sometimes they kind of stick themselves together a little bit. They are all prokaryotic, so none of them have a nucleus to store their DNA. And we do find both autotrophic and heterotrophic forms in this domain. This domain represents an enormous category of life. Bacteria contains organisms that we think of as germs, so things like staph and strep are definitely in this domain. But there are many types of beneficial bacteria that exist as well. For instance, there are bacteria that live in your guts that help you process vitamin K, and there are bacteria that live in the soil that help plants get nitrogen, things like that. So it's a very diverse group. Next we have the domain Archaea, which contains the archaeans. Archaeans are fairly similar to bacteria in certain ways, but they are also very unique. Archaeans are unicellular and prokaryotic, and they're mostly heterotrophic, so most of the archaeans feed on other things to get their energy. But again, they're fairly unique. Genetically, archaeans are more similar to our cells, the eukaryotic cells, than they are to prokaryotic cells. And that's pretty interesting. Also, many archaeans are known as extremophiles. This means that they live in really extreme environments. If you have an environment on this planet and you think it's too extreme for anything to be living in it, there's probably an archaean living there already. Archaeans can live in extremely hot water, extremely cold environments, extremely salty environments. Archaeans have even been found living in highly radioactive environments. So they have some really interesting adaptations. And because of their genetic structure, this third domain was created just for them. The members of the domain Eukarya all have eukaryotic cells, as the name implies. So the cells of all eukaryotes are eukaryotic. They all have nuclei that contain their DNA. You do find both unicellular and multicellular members of this domain, and you do find both autotrophic and heterotrophic forms of life in this domain. But the major characteristic that puts something in the domain Eukarya is the presence of that nucleus. Now, the domain Eukarya can be broken down into 4 smaller groups. In general, we call these groups kingdoms. So let's take a look at each kingdom in a little bit more detail. First, we have Plantae, the kingdom of the plants. And you guys know what plants are. Plants are trees and shrubs and grasses and things that have flowers. Those are all plants. All plants are eukaryotic, so they all have nuclei inside their cells. They are all multicellular, so that means that things like algae that are single-celled are not in this group. They're in a different category. And all plants are autotrophic. Now you may think, what about things like the Venus flytrap? That's a plant that eats things, so that would be a heterotroph, right? Well, technically no. Even the Venus flytrap is photosynthetic. It depends on the sun for its energy. It's actually eating those flies and those ants and little insects to get the nitrogen out of their bodies, not their energy. So all plants are autotrophic. Next we have Animalia, the kingdom of the animals. All animals are eukaryotic, they are all multicellular, and they are all heterotrophic. So there are no animals that exclusively photosynthesize to get their energy. All of the animals shown in this diagram are heterotrophs. You can see they're all eating other things. And I just love this girl on the end because she's just really getting into that burger. She's going to end up with that all over her white shirt. Next we have the kingdom fungi or fungi. This is the kingdom of the funguses and the molds. Now fungi are pretty interesting. They're sort of an intermediate between plants and animals. They grow into forms that look very plant-like, but they actually feed more like an animal feeds. All fungi are eukaryotic. They are all multicellular, so there's no single-celled fungi, but they are all heterotrophic, unlike plants. So when you see mold growing on your piece of bread, what that mold is actually doing is sending little shoots down into the bread that release digestive enzymes. And those enzymes digest the bread and then it sucks it back up into its body. So that mold is actually eating your bread. It's taking it away from you, which makes it a heterotroph. Now, the term protista refers to a group of organisms, a clade, but it's not a kingdom. It's not an official kingdom. The protists are actually a number of different kingdoms. This is a very diverse group of organisms, but essentially, if it doesn't fit into the group of Plantae, Animalia, or fungi, we kind of throw it into the group Protista. Protists include things like algae and amoebas, so kelp forests are made of protists, paramecia, things like that. All protists are eukaryotic. Some are unicellular, such as the amoeba. Some are multicellular, such as this kelp. Some are autotrophic, such as the kelp again, and some are heterotrophic. Amoebas, whether you were aware of it or not, are extremely heterotrophic. They are giant hunting predators, and so they ooze around and absorb other living things. So again, a very diverse group, but technically not a kingdom. Next, I want you to take a couple of minutes to examine the prompts provided on your guided notes. I want you to see if you can classify the organisms based on their characteristics into the proper domains and/or kingdoms of Eukarya. All right, guys, way to go. You're almost ready for class. Before you come to class, I want to make sure that you complete your notes, write down any questions that you want to ask me, and then go into Blackboard and take that pre-class Blackboard quiz. The pre-class Blackboard quiz is due no later than 30 minutes before class time. That gives me a chance to take a look at the results and see what you guys were strong in and what you need more help in, so that I can adapt my lesson for you. Make sure you get that stuff done or it will affect your grade. I'll see you guys in class.